Rejection is clean. It ends. Someone says no, the door closes, and however much it hurts, the pain at least has a shape to it. You know where you stand, you know where the line was drawn, but there is another version of loss that almost never gets named properly because it does not look like rejection at all. It looks like almost winning. The finalist who did not get the part. The relationship that came within inches of becoming real before it quietly dissolved. The opportunity that felt close enough to touch before it disappeared. Almost leaves something behind that a clean no rarely does. Because a clear rejection eventually settles, but almost lingers. It keeps returning. It replays itself at quiet moments, years later sometimes, with a strange clarity that feels disproportionate to what actually happened. And if you have ever wondered why losing by a small margin hurt more than losing outright, the answer is not that you are unusually sensitive. It is that the mind processes near misses through an entirely different mechanism than it processes clear losses, and that mechanism is not particularly gentle. The world your mind built next to this one. It helps to begin with a concept from cognitive psychology called counterfactual thinking, the mind's tendency to construct alternate versions of events that never happened, and then compare reality against them. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Dale Miller, in their work on what they called norm theory, found that people do not evaluate outcomes in isolation. The mind automatically measures reality against a comparison standard that it builds for itself, often without conscious awareness. And what determines the strength of that comparison is not whether the imagined alternative was real. It is how easily the mind can picture it. If an outcome was distant and clearly decided, the mind usually does not spend much effort constructing an alternate version of events. There's very little material to work with. But when something was almost different, decided by a narrow margin, one decision, one conversation, one circumstance, the alternative becomes vivid, easy to imagine, easy to replay. The version where you got the job, the version where they stayed, the version where one thing happened slightly differently and the entire direction of your life shifted. The mind does not simply register what happened, it quietly builds a second world beside this one. And sometimes that imagined world begins to feel emotionally real enough that losing it hurts almost as much as losing something that actually existed. That is why almost carries a different weight. A clean no gives the mind very little to build, almost gives it everything. The slot machine that never pays out. A separate body of research arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion from an unexpected place: gambling studies. Researchers studying slot machine behavior, including psychologist Mark Griffiths and others working in behavioral addiction research, identified something strange about near misses. Imagine a slot machine where two symbols align perfectly and the third stops one position away. Objectively, this outcome is identical to losing. No payout, no reward, nothing has changed. And yet, near misses consistently produce more excitement, more continued play, and greater activation in reward-related brain systems than complete losses do. Neuroimaging studies suggest that the brain processes a near miss as something psychologically closer to a win than a loss, despite the objective outcome remaining exactly the same. The brain briefly behaves as though success was already beginning to happen. Then reality interrupts, and this pattern is not unique to gambling. Slot machines simply reveal a process that exists much more broadly, because being almost chosen works in very similar ways. The interview where you reach the final round, the person who almost committed, the opportunity that looked as though it was opening, your brain had already started building anticipation. On some level, it had already begun preparing for reward, and then suddenly, nothing arrived. The distance between what your brain started expecting and what reality delivered becomes its own kind of pain. You are not reacting only to losing, you are reacting to expectation collapsing. There is another mechanism layered on top of this, and it helps explain why almost can remain alive in memory long after ordinary disappointment has faded. In the 1920s, psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik noticed something unusual while observing waiters in Vienna. They could remember unpaid orders in extraordinary detail. But once the bill had been settled and the task completed, those details faded surprisingly quickly. She later formalized this observation into what became known as the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency for incomplete experiences to remain more cognitively active than completed ones. The mind appears to keep unfinished things open, not symbolically, literally. It continues returning to them, holding them in an active state as though waiting for something to complete the process. A rejection, however painful, eventually closes. The answer was no. The file can slowly be put away, but almost often never provides that ending. The relationship did not truly end, it faded. The opportunity did not fail decisively, it slipped away. The conversation did not close, it simply stopped. And because no clear ending ever arrived, the mind keeps returning to it. Searching, replaying, looking for the missing piece that would finally allow the experience to settle. This is part of why an almost from years ago can still feel unexpectedly vivid, not because it mattered more, because it was never filed as finished. Why this hurts most in love and work. These mechanisms tend to become particularly powerful in two places, relationships and work, and there are reasons for that. In romantic situations, the mind is given enormous amounts of material to build alternate futures from. Real conversations, real moments, real chemistry, specific details. The more detailed an imagined future becomes, the more convincing it feels. The mind is not working with abstractions anymore. It is working with scenes, images, memories of something that almost existed. And because those details are vivid, the alternate reality becomes vivid too. Professional near misses often contain something else layered on top. Identity, being the finalist, the runner-up, the almost higher, often arrives with specific explanations. You were very close. It came down to one thing. You narrowly missed it. And these details give the mind precision. Instead of wondering vaguely what happened, the mind now has exact measurements to work with. And exact measurements create stronger counterfactuals than uncertainty does. Now the alternate world becomes easier to construct. One different answer, one different choice, one different moment, and suddenly everything changes. Or at least, that is what the mind begins repeating. Why you cannot reason your way out of it. This is also why simple reassurance often fails. It was not meant to be. Everything happens for a reason. You'll find something better. These ideas speak to the outcome, but they do not address the machinery underneath it. They do not quiet the alternate reality still being generated. They do not undo the anticipation the brain had already started building. And they do not close the unfinished file still sitting open somewhere in memory. Research suggests something more specific tends to help. Counterfactual worlds weaken gradually as life introduces new information, new experiences, new relationships, new directions. The brain slowly updates itself as reality becomes larger than the alternate timeline it was holding on to, and unfinished experiences often become easier to release when people deliberately create structure around them. Psychologist James Pennebaker's work on expressive writing found that constructing a coherent narrative around unresolved experiences can reduce the intrusive quality those memories often carry. Writing what happened, writing what it meant, writing why it ended. Not because the story changes, but because the mind finally receives enough structure to stop endlessly searching for one. The mind does not necessarily need closure from the other person. Sometimes it only needs an ending. The pain of being almost chosen was never proportional to how close you actually came, even if it felt that way. It was proportional to how vividly the mind constructed the world beside this one, how strongly reward systems briefly believed something good was arriving, how stubbornly unfinished things resist being put down. None of that means the almost did not matter. It means your mind was doing exactly what minds do when something ends without really ending. Holding it, turning it over, waiting for a conclusion that was never coming from the outside. You were not too sensitive. You were not holding on because you were weak. You were responding exactly the way human beings tend to respond when the margin becomes that small. The ending you were waiting for was never somewhere behind you. It was always waiting to be written by the person still carrying the story. And once it finally is, the mind usually knows what to do next. Another door opens quietly, and another story begins.